325ers, welcome back. We trudge on. We are now past the Civil War, and we're really going to look at the period between the Civil War and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinese immigration will be kind of our central focus, really because Chinese exclusion and the reaction to the Chinese are going to set the stage for nearly every reaction to American immigration after it. Interestingly, Chinese immigration may be one of those categories that you don't think about. You don't think of the Chinese population as being a large population or having a large effect on American society. But the reality is that Chinese exclusion, the reaction to the Chinese, are going to fundamentally set the contours of American immigration policy, and certainly how Americans react to immigration. So what's our outline? So in this post-Civil War period, we're going to look at Irish immigration once again, although this is going to be very different from the Irish immigration we looked at before. This is not the famine immigration, for example. We're going to look at German and Scandinavian immigration. It really is a kind of a counterpoint to both Irish, and then later, again, our main focus is the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then really the legacy of exclusion, what this is going to mean for the United States. So after the war, what happens after the Civil War? Well, as we saw last time, the Know-Nothings had limited success politically, but the reality is that slavery overwhelmed that issue. Most Know-Nothings actually become Republicans because they're anti-slavery advocates, but the Know-Nothing Party and a single party dedicated to a nativist bent is going to disappear. That doesn't mean, however, that nativism is going to disappear. That doesn't mean, however, that this idea of opposition to foreign peoples is going to disappear. In fact, it's going to ratchet up during this period, as we will see. Another thing that's going to occur after the Civil War, and really as a result of the Civil War, is the nationalization of immigration policy, really the nationalization of many features of the American government. When you have the Reconstruction Amendments, right, the abolishment of slavery, the granting of voting rights to African Americans, civil rights protections, things of that nature, all of those are going to be wrought at a national level. And what we're going to see during this period is, in terms of immigration specifically, is the federal government taking more and more control of immigration, and specifically immigration policy. Believe it or not, up to this point, the federal government had largely been hands-off. It had mostly been up to the states. States controlled specific elements of naturalization and processing. This is one of the things, in fact, the Know-Nothings were after, is they wanted to nationalize this policy. They wanted to set a kind of general standard for immigrants coming in because it varied so much. But what we'll see in this period is the decline of state power in regard to immigration and the rise of federal power in regard to immigration. Specifically after the Civil War, though, maybe the most dominant feature is going to be immigration encouragement. One of the things that the Civil War does is it results in the death of millions and millions of people. Largely, we look at the Civil War, we focus on aspects of slavery, you focus on the battles and things of that nature. But after the war, there is a dearth of workers because of all of the deaths that occur as a result of the Civil War. If you remember back, we have the market revolution that is continuing into this period. In fact, it, as well as nationalization, is going to ratchet up. We're going to see a really explosion in industrialization and manufacturing, and America is going to need workers. The Homestead Act of 1862, actually passed by President Abraham Lincoln, is also going to encourage settlement. Immigrants coming in, particularly from Europe, are going to be able to buy land in the United States at very cheap prices. And so that's also going to spur immigration after the Civil War itself. So what does some of this immigration look like, right? So we talked about the Irish, and we painted a specific picture of Irish immigration in the previous lecture. But what is interesting about that picture is that it's only one period in time, right? I mean, we have to contextualize that immigration with the larger scope of Irish immigration, because the reality is more Irish immigrate after the Civil War than before. Now, importantly, what the 2.6 million arriving after 1860 have, that say the famine immigration generation did not, is the infrastructure of second generation Irish. So first generation is the person that moves to the country. Second generation is actually the first person born in the country from that immigrant family. And so what we have for the Irish especially is you have a great infrastructure with family ties, but also political ties, social ties, economic ties that these 2.6 million are going to immigrate into, right? There's already going to be this establishment that the famine immigration did not have. And again, this is importantly connected to politics. One of the things that the Irish are able to do even before the war and continue after the war is to be an integral part of democratic politics. In fact, during the Civil War itself in 1863, there are draft riots in New York City. Many of these draft riots are led by Irish workers and Irish men and women, and they're going to raid various communities, but they're going to specifically target African American communities. In fact, one of the groups of Irish rioters is going to burn down a what's called the Colored Orphans Asylum in New York City. And they're not going to have any reaction as a result of that. One thing that the Irish are going to learn is that there's always going to be a group that they can push down to push themselves up. They're going to find it in African Americans in cities such as New York. They're also going to find it in Chinese immigration later on in this period. So that's something to keep in mind. But also, too, in somewhat a defense of the Irish, they are incredibly adept at transitioning to American life. They find ways into politics. Again, they find ways into the American economy, and they build themselves up. There's a great amount of social mobility for these Irish immigrants in the post-war period. Now, there is still stringent opposition to the Irish during this period. And in fact, there may be even more general opposition to the Irish during this period. As we mentioned before, the famine migration, that opposition was really connected with Catholicism. It was really connected with a cultural sense of the Irish. Now, anti-Irish and specifically anti-Catholicism has been a long strain in American history. And in fact, it's a strain that continues into this day. If you think about it, we've only had one Catholic president in the entire history of the United States, despite Catholics representing a majority of Christians in the United States. So that's something to think about in terms of not only anti-Irish, but also anti-Catholic antagonisms. After the Civil War, however, there is going to be this shift toward a more racial opposition to the Irish. One of the things that occurs largely after the Civil War is the rise of what we call scientific racism. Also, more loosely, we call it eugenics. This idea that there are a specific amount of races in the entire world, and everyone fits into one of those races. And there's going to be this attempt by many to essentially equate the Irish with African Americans and with Africans. Irish have had a long colonial history with the British Empire. That is going to be a part of this opposition. It's also going to be an opposition of Irish influence, specifically when we look at some of these more racial depictions of the Irish with kind of ape-like features. You see this, this is the ignorant vote. And what we have is on a scale, a black set next to clearly an Irishman, in terms of that their votes are weighted. But you can also see similarities between the two populations. This is a drawing from Thomas Nast, who was a political cartoonist in the late 19th century. Thomas Nast is also vehemently anti-Irish. The Irish are going to be part of a New York political machine that NAST is in opposition to. And so one of the things that NAST is going to do is call into question the whiteness of the Irish. Are these Irish white enough to get the privileges that they're able to have? You'll see in this picture here, this, the kind of, again, the false idea of the melting pot. This is the Irishman who can't fit into the melting pot. There's no way to fit him in with all of these other countries, right? It says down here, the mortar of assimilation and the one element that won't mix. So there's still heavy opposition to the Irish. But importantly, there is a general shift of that opposition from these cultural features, right? Religion, even economics in terms of the depravity that these famine immigrants are coming into. And the shift is to a more racialized version of the Irish, because importantly, after the Civil War, there is a reformulation of citizenship. There's a reformulation of whiteness vis-a-vis the now 4 million freed people that are no longer slaves in the United States, that now also have theoretical access to equal rights, theoretical access to voting rights. And so one of the things that NAST is doing is connecting the Irish with those populations. So, as opposed to the Irish, who are still largely going to congregate in cities, one of the things that you largely don't see with the Irish is a real push beyond the eastern seaboard. They're largely, because that's where the previous immigrations had gone to, that's where these other immigrations are largely going to go to. Germans and Scandinavians, in contrast, are largely going to move out to the Midwest, for example, and to the South, but really the Midwest and the Great Plains area. They have the financial capital to be able to make that move. These are the groups largely taking advantage of the Homestead Act of 1862, and they're very successful. Whereas the Irish are going to have stringent opposition. Importantly, right, it's never that the Irish aren't white. At no time is Irish immigration stifled, stemmed. At no time do the Irish lose the vote. But there is a questioning of their whiteness. There's a questioning of their ability to be American citizens. Germans and Scandinavians, for the most part, aren't going to have this. Again, they're very successful. Many of them bring over brewing traditions that are going to set up very successful businesses in the Midwest and abroad. However, this isn't to say that the Germans and Scandinavians don't have their own opposition, particularly with the Germans. As we move toward World War I, you're going to see really an attack on the German language. Now, because the Germans are able to move to the Midwest, they are also able to replicate in large part kind of German enclaves in many cities, if not have large German cities onto themselves. And so German is a common language in the Midwest. If you've ever been to the Midwest, more likely than not, you've been through a German named city, seen German influences all throughout that area of the United States. And so in school, they would speak German. In everyday interactions, they would speak German. But as World War II commences, the German language itself is going to come under incredible threat. In fact, Germans themselves are going to come under incredible threat from nativists, from people who see Germans as a kind of fifth column, as people that are going to undermine the American effort in the war. And so what you see is the great decline of the German language after World War I. Some German families changed their names to avoid the kind of opposition they're going to receive in their everyday lives. Many cease speaking German in public, only speaking German in their homes. There's going to be movements against the use of German in schools. So, there is going to be some opposition for these groups, but nothing, say, in comparison to the Irish. In fact, for the most part, Germans and Scandinavians are immensely successful and really become a new part of American society with their own traditions and things of that nature. Now, the large part of our lecture for this unit is Chinese immigration and the importance of Chinese immigration set against, say, German and Scandinavian, set against the Irish. Because unlike the Irish, unlike Germans or Scandinavians, Chinese are clearly different from many other Americans. Chinese immigration really originates in the gold rush of 1849. In fact, the word for the United States in Chinese was Gold Mountain. The gold rush, just kind of a quick aside, was actually an international affair. You have people coming from all over the world in order to try and reap the benefits of the gold. But what you also have very early on are efforts from white settlers, specifically white Americans, to carve out their own specific space, particularly against the Chinese laborers that are coming in. In the gold mines, there's going to be what's known as the foreign miners tax, which is essentially going to make it too expensive for any Chinese laborer to have a mine or work in a mine, because they have to pay the tax first, and then whatever money they can get off of those mines isn't going to be enough to even cover the tax itself. So there's already initial opposition to the Chinese. In terms of numbers, you can see here, right, 1849 to 1882, only 300,000 Chinese immigrants are coming in. The Chinese are largely going to relegate themselves to those jobs not wanted by white Americans. They're going to work in the mines. They're going to work heavily on the railroads. The Irish are going to work on the railroads really coming from the east to the west, and the Chinese are going to be the ones building from the west to the east. And so they're an important part of the Western economy. They're an important part of the Western society. And importantly, too, while that 300,000 is a smaller number, it's also a concentrated number. Most of the Chinese are going to immigrate to the same places, kind of somewhat similar to what the Irish are doing on the East Coast. The Chinese are going to be doing on the West Coast. Now, there is, after the railroads are completed, the Chinese are going to start populating jobs in agriculture, in industry, and they're going to start working with white laborers as well. And this is where we're going to see a great amount of consternation. And in 1867, the United States and China are going to agree to the Burlingame Treaty, which is going to establish strong economic ties and is going to bring in more immigrants after this period in 1867. And so what we're going to see after 1867 is a rise in opposition and a rise in the attempts to stop Chinese immigration. So as you can see here, we'll go with the picture on what's my right. And what this indicates is the incredible difference of the Chinese. This idea that the Chinese are so different from this ideal American that they'll never become a part of American society. You see here the father with his family coming home from work, and these are the Chinese workers coming home from after work. They're crammed into, they have no intent on building families. Some of them are eating rats right here. This gentleman is just finished with his opium pipe. So the implication, right, is that the Chinese don't build families. The Chinese are drug addicts. The Chinese eat animals. The Chinese are this different from what the American should be, and that these men are taking his job is the implication behind this. That no longer will he be able to come to his home because of these Chinese workers. The other picture, as you can see, is a Irishman pounding on someone from China. Now, importantly, the opposition to the Chinese in the West is largely going to be led by Irish workers. There is the Working Men's Party out of California that is led by a man named Dennis Kearney. Dennis Kearney, who himself is a naturalized Irish immigrant. So he is an immigrant, but as we see, right, this isn't just subject to the Irish, but other groups are going to find the group that's more different than they are and then use that group to find their own social mobility. And particularly the Irish are going to do this in the West with the Chinese. Let me see. So before we get to the Exclusion Act, one of the other things I want to bring up is this Irish opposition and the importance, again, of Irish politics and now Western politics. One of the things that the opposition to the Chinese, one, it's strictly racial. There isn't anything cultural about this opposition. There are accusations that the Chinese are coming over as coolies, that they're coming over really as slave labor, that the women are coming over as prostitutes. And so there's this emphasis on all of the features that the Chinese have that Americans don't have and Americans don't want. But at the core, the opposition to the Chinese, there's this idea that they will never become American because they are too different, that their culture is too different, that their image is in fact too different. And so Kearney and the other Workingman Party are going to essentially establish an anti-Chinese party. That party is largely folded into the Democratic Party of California, and the Democratic Party nationwide begins to win elections because of the advantage that it has out west. And essentially, Republicans who encourage immigration for most of this period, right? It's the Republicans that passed the Homestead Act. It's the Republicans that are encouraging all of the immigration in. They initially oppose these kind of actions, but after they lose election after election, they quickly also move to an anti-Chinese stance. Essentially, politics is what brings about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And so what does the act do? It suspends the immigration for 10 years and makes this act permanent in 1904. So you have Chinese exclusion essentially extending from 1882 until 1943, in fact. It creates the system for deportation because one of the things that the Chinese Exclusion Act does is it now sets the Chinese as not being allowed into the country, that they want to stop Chinese immigration from the source. And how do they do that? They have to deport them out of the country. By 1917, you have the creation of the Asiatic Barred Zone, right? The D got lost there by the picture itself. But essentially, while Japanese immigration is still allowed after 1882, by 1917, there's going to be a complete bar on what they call the Asiatic zone. So any Asians are not allowed to come into the country. So again, what we see this is the nationalization of immigration policy. The politics of immigration force it to a national level. The Workingmen's Party has success, so they're folded in by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has success. They're winning elections in California. They're winning elections out west. They're winning national elections. Republicans don't want to take those kind of hits. They're not going to protect the Chinese and lose elections. So they're going to shift their opposition to the Chinese in order to protect their own elections. With the Chinese Exclusion Act, the federal government is also saying, we are in control of immigration policy. We are going to be the ones that create this policy. You see here, 1891, they create a Bureau of Immigration. What we're going to see after 1882 is the expansion of federal power in order to keep the Chinese out, right? Now that the United States has declared that the Chinese are not allowed in, the United States needs to create the bureaucratic apparatus in order to keep them out. Immigration officials, a Bureau of Immigration, immigration depots, all of these things are connected with Chinese immigration. And importantly, restriction and exclusion become the dominant federal policies toward immigration. What the Chinese Exclusion Act does is it ends the period of no restrictions on immigration. We've talked about ways that they've tried to, say, extend citizenship, maybe extend naturalization, but no group has had their immigration stopped or restricted or excluded. The Chinese are the first to do this. But after the Chinese, it's going to be a question of how much restriction, not whether or not the United States should restrict. And so what are the consequences of the Chinese Exclusion Act? As I mentioned, this is going to set the stage for immigration policy moving forward. In fact, we still operate under this idea that the United States has to restrict the population of immigrants coming in. This is a legacy of the Chinese Exclusion Act. To give you an idea of what else the Chinese Exclusion Act did, it's going to create visas, green cards, the immigration depot, the policing of immigration, this idea that immigrants need to be processed before they can be allowed into the country. Those that are not included will be sent back to their country. You're actually going to see the creation of embassies to try and monitor immigration before it even gets to the United States. But importantly, with the Chinese as well, race is going to become the central feature of restriction and inclusion. This idea that the Chinese are so different, and they're clearly not white, right? I mean, one of the things that the Irish do have is in terms, while their whiteness is questioned, it's really a matter of how white are they? Are they white enough? With the Chinese, that debate doesn't even occur. The Chinese are clearly not white. And as a result of that, the Chinese are then eligible for exclusion as a result. And lastly, we see the creation of a nationalized policy. Ellis Island is going to develop after this period, but we're really also going to see the policing of American immigration and this idea that the federal government is in charge of this. The federal government is going to regulate this, and immigration policy as a whole is going to be based on restriction and control rather than unlimited immigration. So what are our conclusions for this lecture? We see large-scale assimilation by the Irish, German, and Scandinavians after the war. All three groups are largely successful, with the Irish and German having kind of pockets of opposition to them. Nativism is still a heavy presence in this period. They're going to have success with the Chinese and Chinese exclusion. And then finally, Chinese exclusion is going to set up really immigration policy moving forward. It's going to be a federal matter. It's going to be federal policing, and the categories for exclusion are going to be largely tied in with the race of that particular immigration group. And really what we're going to see is the more non-white the groups are, the more eligible they are for exclusion.